capitalism. We are nearing the end of May, and but we still have 5 more events in May, and I want to clue you in on them before we get on to today's The Age of Circulation Struggles. Tomorrow at 3 p.m., we have Abolish the Family with Kathy Weeks, Sophie Lewis, Sarah Jaffe, and Michelle O'Brien. At 6 p.m., Predation Confronts Decline with Robert Brenner and Aaron Benonev giving us their views of the economic forecast, or giving us the economic forecast. And then on Saturday at 1 p.m., we have the COVID crisis and the carceral state with Jackie Wang, Brett Story, Elise Thorburn, Dan Berger, Megan Ibarra, former mayoral candidate for the People's Party, Nikita Oliver, and J.M. Wong. And at 5 p.m., we have the Ghosts of Marxism's Spectre Editors in Conversation on Crisis from the new magazine, the new journal, left journal Spectre. The 6 editors, Charlie Post, David McNally, Holly Lewis, Kate Doyle-Griffiths, Vanessa Wills, and Zachary Levinson, are each going to pick a passage from the Marxist corpus and elaborate on it. Kind of a clever idea. And on Sunday, at I don't know what time, I think it's at noon, is it, Sean? We have the Borders and Contagion with Dan Denver, Jasker Dillon, Malev Kanuga, Megan Ibarra, and so anyway, lots of good stuff coming up till the end of the month. We are powered, of course, by a lot of volunteer power, but we do need some money. Not a hell of a lot, but some money. And so go to www.redmayseattle.org and click on donate and give us whatever you can, or you can do it on our YouTube page. There's a link at the bottom, and also subscribe to our YouTube our YouTube channel. If we get over 1,000, we're getting close. We get real-time CCTV captions. But anyway, now I will turn the event over to our moderator today, Sarah Jaffe, who's one of the co-hosts of Belabored with Michelle Chen, the labor podcast from Dissent. She's also the author of Necessary Trouble and a book, forthcoming book, whose title, gee, I wish I had thought of that, is Work Won't Love You Back. Pretty good. Okay, Sarah, take it away.
See, now you made me feel bad because I was going to try to save some time by not reading everybody's full bio, but then you just read mine, and now I feel bad. But anyway, hello, I'm just the moderator. I'm actually the least interesting person here by a long shot. And I want to take up as little time as possible because I want to let them all talk about circulation struggles, which are in many ways the way the working class is struggling these days. Struggles against fuel taxes, transit fares, rail systems, pipelines, many more things that I'm sure everybody will bring up. So I am going to ask everybody to forgive me for not reading these full bios. I am going to instead ask them to go in alphabetical order by last name, since once again, there's a lot of us. So I'm going to ask Joshua Clover to start. Then we will have Glen Coulthard, Nick Estes, Michael Hardt, Phil Neal, and last but very much not least, Camila Vergara. So without any further from me, Joshua, tell us what circulation struggles are.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I want to thank Red May and Philip and Sarah for taking on the task of moderating here. One of my favorite people. I want to thank all my co-panelists, and I'll try and get right into it. I may end up having a slightly different sense of circulation struggles than those limited to moving shit around, but that is certainly core to it. And I'll see if I can gloss it along the way as I try and talk about a couple of different events that interest me. It took us 66 days to get from the very first shelter-in-place order to the first major riot, which I think is pretty impressive, which alongside the absolute outrage that I assume and trust we're all feeling about the murder of George Floyd, we might also register some small sense of hope that it remains possible for people to struggle for the very possibility of their own flourishing, to struggle together and in the streets. Some hope that we had not somehow eclipsed that possibility in the current dispensation. And alongside the outrage over another police murder of another Black person, the dynamics of those 66 days are really complicated and really weird and really illuminating. The 66 days were characterized dramatically by rent strikes, which are really much closer to riots, in that they are struggles over the money price of survival in the marketplace, not over labor costs and conditions. That is, they're circulation struggles, not production struggles. Though we might also say that rent strikes are reproduction struggles, the household being a foundational site of collective reproduction. The 66 days were also characterized by numerous labor actions, strikes among them. Bizarrely, these labor actions included what might be understood as anti-strikes, militant, if staged and organized and inorganic, demands to be able to work for the given wages and conditions or worse. As unemployment in the United States passes 40 million, and labor market participation, which is maybe a better measure, slips toward a historic 50%, the fraction of people whose lives remain situated in circulation, in transport and exchange and consumption, in market dependency, even when unemployed, ordered by the cost of keeping yourself alive as an individual or a community. The logic of circulation strikes has arguably never been higher. And it is this that we speak of when we speak of the age of circulation struggles, which is the title of this event. Now, I've already mentioned one specific event in the recent past. In fact, it's ongoing, which is the current riots in Minnesota, whose specificity is not yet entirely clear. The horrific non-specificity of the way it starts with the police murder of a Black person surely is demoralizing, and more so to all of us. If there's a specificity, it may be about looting, maybe just because Minneapolis is the home to the Target Corporation. Maybe more than that. Now, the usual assholes will say the usual things, but the peculiar situation in which we find ourselves, when the question of how basic goods get from the hands of capitalists to the homes of proletarians, when this question has never been so emphasized, when the piling up of goods elsewhere has never so obviously been recognized as hoarding of necessary social wealth, this scenario is maybe something new. Maybe the political revelation of 2020 could be not, whoa, a kind of socialist almost became a presidential nominee, but rather, wow, the barriers to accessing survival goods are absurd and unacceptable. That this knowledge already exists, is already racialized, this is important. The racialized underclass must bear, among other things, the heavy knowledge that the property system is death, and that the police are the keepers of that system and thus the keepers of death. This is part of the knowledge, I believe, that comes with having been property with the tradition of chattel slavery. In the absence of free circulation, when we can't leave our homes, when essential delivery workers risk their lives to circulate goods, the long history barring free circulation of some humans is more present than ever. I think that gives us an occasion to reflect on what circulation is and what role the police and the state play in maintaining its possibilities, its limits, its necessities, and its fatality. Now, I want to mention two other events in the time I have left. And these are drawn from last year, which was to be our topic originally when Philip and the team put together Red May so many months ago in ways that have necessarily transformed dramatically. One of the events that I want to mention is the blockade of the Black Diamond Coal Mining Company that happened in Kentucky. I'm sure many of you followed it. It was a striking event. Sorry, I think that ends up being an ironic formulation because it turned out not to be a strike. Black Diamond, a coal company, went out of business. In going out of business, they failed to pay wages effectively for the last month of their existence to their coal miners, one of the riskiest jobs in the world. Average life expectancy of coal miners in the US is 58 years, if you're wondering. And they didn't pay the final wages, but the coal miners could not go on strike because there was no company to strike against. So they hit upon the obvious solution, I think obvious, which was to blockade the tracks where the last remaining bits of black diamond coal were left and had not yet been taken to market to be sold. And they made that delivery impossible, a classic circulation struggle for a classic labor demand, right? This is the most standard labor demand. Pay us, you motherfuckers. But it had to be made, it had to be conducted as a circulation struggle. So that scenario in which even production demands have to be conducted as circulation struggles about the circulation of goods and commodities and who can make them and who can't and who controls it is, I think, a notable and signal fact going forward into the future. The other specific event I want to talk about, and there's many, many to draw from over 2019, a year filled with planetary circulation struggles. But the one I want to draw on is the Indigenous Wet'suwet'en struggles last year against TransCanada's Coastal GasLink pipeline, among other things. It's actually been going on longer than a year. I don't want to diminish it, but it came to a head, as it were, over the course of the last year. And I want to trace that tradition of circulation struggles, which is the pipeline blockade. In doing so, I might end up in a friendly disagreement with Nick on the panel, though I'm open to the possibility he might be right. Nick is almost always right, as far as I can tell. But this, I think, can be a subject of perhaps friendly discussion. It's hard for me to separate the history of indigenous encampments in North America, Turtle Island, anti-infrastructure encampments from the history of economic crisis. I might start that history, if you have to start it somewhere, with the Dene Declaration of 1975, which explicitly provides a declaration on development that is all about resisting a pipeline in the Mackenzie Valley. This is the forerunner, I think, again, if we want to narrate history this way, of contemporary water protectors, of Idle No More, of Standing Rock, and of the Wet'suwet'en struggle. And 1975 is, you know, right about the time of the great shift of 1973, the waning of profits in production in North America that signals the long crisis, the shift to circulation struggles, and notably the oil crisis that sets fossil extraction at the top of capital's to-do list. So when we think about the present, and particularly the form of the pipeline blockade as a circulation struggle, which is the one that I think is most ambitious in some sense, it's hard for me not to see how this history of economic transformation and the development and insistence on pipeline blockade encampments, how these things are not entangled. And I think it's important for struggles going forward to see the specificity of the pipeline blockade as a historic indigenous tactic in North America, as a specifically environmental tactic, and also as a tactic that combines both the circulation struggle in that it impedes the flow of capital, it blocks the circulation of extractivist goods, of oil and gas and so on, but also as a reproductive struggle, right? When the camp forms, it has to reproduce itself every day. And these two things are the same. The reproduction of the camp is the blockade. The blockade is the reproduction of the encampment. So you get this, the simultaneity of a reproduction struggle, what we might call a commune or a commune in waiting, and a circulation struggle that's directly antagonistic to capital. And I think that it's toward those kinds of struggles that I feel the greatest sense of excitement and optimism, insofar as any optimism is possible in this fucked up world. Thank you all very much.
All right, I don't really need to jump in here, but Glen Coulthard is up next.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I just wanted to say thanks to the crew at Red May, all the volunteers that made it happen, also Phil. And actually, Josh's segue works well with what I want to talk to, which is to give a little bit more detail about Indigenous agents in what we're calling circulation struggles. Just to kind of give a little bit of context, this is some new work that I've been kind of compiling, and it's really based on oral histories of 60s and 70s activism, both here and in the Northwest Territories, here being British Columbia, that kind of provide a preface to what I was trying to get at in previous work. And as a non-written history so far, it's really indebted to the people that I've talked to. So I want to mention Jerry Ambers, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, Lee Miracle, and also Ray Bob, who are quite central in this organizing. So I'm going to talk about a Maoist organization, or Maoish organization, that existed in Vancouver between 1967 and roughly 1975, and how I think their political economic analysis really kind of acts as a predecessor to the Wet'suwet'en struggles and the kind of struggles around blockades that we see today. So they were called themselves the Native Alliance for Red Power, and it was established in Vancouver in the late fall of 1967 after a meeting was called by several Indigenous women in response to the controversial trial involving a rape and murder of a Native teenager named Rosemary Roper by 3 wrongfully acquitted, more or less acquitted, white men near Williams Lake in British Columbia. According to NARP founding members, Henry Jack and Jerry Ambers, the rank and file of NARP were drawn from a wide cross-section of the growing urban Indigenous community, including men and women, ex-convicts, high school dropouts, a few academics, as well as university students, and a number of members of the growing Native working class who had either lived in or had recently migrated to the city during the period. NARP was formed explicitly as a direct action or protest group that sought to represent grassroots issues in ways that its members thought that the emerging state subsidized First Nations organizations weren't doing in an urgent or radical enough manner. The political line developed by NARP during this period was as eclectic and anti-establishment as its youthful membership. Predating both the formation of the American Indian movement in 1968 and the Alcatraz occupation of 69 to 71, NARP drew critical inspiration from a combination of sources. The indigenous cultural traditions and political histories of its membership, the national liberation struggles of the Third World, the women's liberation movement, and the politics of Black Power in the United States. In terms of Black Power, the most evident political influence on NARP organizers came from the platform and politics of the Black Party, or Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, with which NARP members had established an early relationship via its Seattle chapter in 1968. As shared with me by Jerry Ambers, one of the NARP's founders, herself and another NARP member, a dude named Tony Antoine, felt it important to reach out in solidarity to the newly formed Seattle chapter by contacting the organization to inform them of their own work, and to tell them specifically that they'd be willing to sell the Panther newsletter to help raise money and support the Black liberation struggle in the United States. In response, their Seattle contact suggested that representatives of the two organizations get together to discuss the basis of unity. Following the meeting, Ambers and Antoine returned to Vancouver and, along with other core NARP members, established their own political platform expressed as an 8-point program, which was borrowed by and adapted from the Panthers' 10-point program with the party's consent. Commenting on the diverse uptake of the platform, Bobby Seale once stated that theirs is a, quote, universal program, and that several, quote, ethnic revolutionary groups such as the American or the Mexican-American Brown Berets, the Chinese-American Red Guards, the American Indian NARP, and others have programs similar to ours. Although our program, they claim, was written specifically for the basic needs and desires of Black people in mind, everybody who wants it can have it. It isn't the program of the BPP because it was dreamt up by us. It is so because it came from the people. Now, the 10-point program was itself inspired by the global dissemination, at least in part, of Mao's Little Red Book, particularly its insistence on the universality of any given political line being informed by and tested against the lived reality of the masses in struggle. On the surface, at least, then, built into Maoism was a theoretical and political versatility that was well suited for its diverse uptake. As of course, Robin Kelly and Betsy Esch have explained, central to Maoism was the idea that Marxism can and must be reshaped to the requirements of time and space or place, and that practical work ideas and leadership stem from the masses in movement, not from a theory created in the abstract. Now, this was incredibly important to burgeoning Black and brown radicals in the US, as for it broke with certain tendencies within some Western Marxisms that tethered the revolutionary potential of so-called underdeveloped or BIPOC and communities of color to appropriately develop material conditions in the progressive unfolding of history, with presumably white laboring city dwellers in the lead. Mao's insistence on the revolutionary capacity of the peasantry not being dependent on the proletariat in urbanized centers broke significantly with this developmentalist framework, both in theory and practice. This was paramount for radicals of color in the US and Canada because it meant that they need not wait for the development of supposedly objective material conditions in order to launch their own revolutionary struggles. Now, as a political formation committed to direct action, NARP carried out many activities. Especially if Mao's displacement of the white urban proletariat provided particular inspiration to Black nationalists like the Panthers, this insight, I want to suggest, was taken even more literally by the likes of NARP. Maoism was attractive to its red power advocates here because it displaced not only the white proletariat, but also the geographical location of classic accounts of revolutionary struggle from the cities to the countryside, or in our cases here, the land. This reorientation was the absolute core of Mao's attraction, although there were others. The countryside encirclement of the city strategy situated centuries-long indigenous commitments to land defense as not only a revolutionary act, but also necessary for any effective political economic resistance to the nature of capital accumulation in political economies like Canada's, based significantly as they are on extraction. In such contexts, extractivist development projects are foundational to accumulation, given the need to manage an inherently crisis-prone system that cyclically confronts problems of profitability. In Canada, geopolitical instabilities resulting in a rhetorical aversion from acquiring desired resources from unstable regions in the world, dirty oil, or in my case, blood diamonds, has in part spawned a 4-decade-long aggressive turn inward to devour domestic land and resources through increased extractivism and the ramping up of resultant exports as a means to mitigate these crises of accumulation and profitability. This analysis was made explicit by members of NARP in their evaluation of the oil crises of the early 1970s and the subsequent demand it created to increase colonial exploration and capitalist development in Denendeh, the homelands of my own people, which was referenced by Joshua previously. Dialectically, they link the struggles of the Third World to what they call the colonial character of the capitalist mode of production in the North. And they write, and I'm going to quote because this is quite important. The ripening of contradictions and the growth of the struggle in the Middle East, the main source of oil for imperialism, brought about an energy crisis in the imperialist nations. They redirect, from that time, we could detect an alteration in the profit-making strategy. They redirected their investments in oil exploration from the Middle East to the imperialist nations. The rationale for this was the growth of national liberation and social revolution in the Third World was creating an unsafe political climate for investment. Thus, to maintain sources of raw material, it is necessary to find safe areas of investment. The focus for this redirection is the Canadian North, and by and large, it has already been explored and decisions have been made on the division of the North amongst various imperialist interests. The only impediment holding up a wholesale corporate invasion is the fact that the North is, and has been for tens of thousands of years, the legitimate domain of Native people. It represents the only or one of the only vestiges of a genuine national territory for Native people, wherein they can realize the aspirations to which all peoples are rightfully entitled, nationhood. And of course, similar dynamics remain at play today, which is clearly demonstrated in the resistance of the Wet'suwet'en and Secwepemc land defenders against a marked increase in proposed pipeline construction and liquefied natural gas development on their traditional territories. Under such conditions, indigenous land-based resistance is increasingly being recognized as foundational to large-scale social transformation and has subsequently forced the state and capital to respond in kind through the production of what Shiri Pasternak has called new terrorist identities, risk economies, and security networks that will configure colonization and capitalism in the years to come. So in short, Maoism's geographical shift in the terrain of anti-colonial struggle synced well with the century-plus long commitment by indigenous nations in British Columbia to land defense, which NARP carried forward into the late 60s and early 70s through a number of actions, including support for and participation in blockades and land reclamations exemplified by the West Coast Nisqually fishing rights struggle south of the Canada-US border in the mid-60s, the Fort Lawton military base occupation in 1970, and the Cache Creek R blockade in the BC interior in 1974. And to my mind, I think that the significance of these types of indigenous-led actions are only now being theoretically given the attention they deserve on the non-native left. So to conclude, the activities of organizations like NARP show what indigenous land struggles have to materially offer in terms of forging a genuine politics of solidarity across social struggles that for many reasons don't always see eye to eye. I hope that their story might continue to mitigate these tensions by highlighting a critically important example of intellectual and political collaboration, one in which indigenous land and sovereignty struggles are thought to intersect necessarily and productively with other liberation efforts and theories. As an example of radical indigenous internationalism, to borrow Nick's phrase, NARP dared to imagine a world altogether free of colonial hierarchies of race, class, nation, and gender, and sought to align itself with communities colonized both at home and abroad, committed to achieving similar ends. So I'll leave it at that and open it up for questions later. Masi Cho, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't know if I mentioned at the beginning that we will be taking audience questions through the Facebook chat and the YouTube chat, so you can put those in and we will read those at the end. But for now, I'm going to hand this over to Nick.
Hello, everyone. I'll just start by building off of some of the things that were said by both Glenn and Joshua, whose work intersects very much with mine. And this is new work that I've been thinking about and writing about, theorizing land defense as labor, but also as Glenn had said, and Glenn has talked about elsewhere, as really central to challenging, global capitalism. But I think it's important to kind of ground this talk and what we're talking about in the present, as Joshua has done. And there's a desperate search right now, I think, to find a reason behind the current tragedy. The US deceit and distortion surrounding the response to coronavirus is so sadly familiar that a death toll exceeding 100,000 has lost its power to shock. Each day surpasses the next, not only in terms of a rising body count, but also in levels of cynicism. Many people label it unprecedented times. For the indigenous, there is plenty of precedent, and not one virus, but two, a centuries-old plague. Manifest destiny is an intoxicating hallucination. It infects the actions of US institutions and policy, but especially the minds of leaders, convincing many that they are, by the grace of the creator, justified in genocide, theft of a continent, and the domination of the planet. The projection of this power has no earthly limits. America has always been a frontier nation, Trump remarked at the most recent State of the Union address. Now we must embrace the next frontier, he said, America's manifest destiny in the stars. Within weeks, he issued an executive order creating the sixth branch of the military, the Space Force, to quote, organize, train, and equip military space forces to ensure unfettered access to and freedom to operate in space. 2 months later, the pandemic surged. Millions lost their jobs in numbers exceeding the Great Depression, and healthcare workers scrambled to secure face masks and ventilators. Amid the chaos, the president signed an executive order granting the United States the preemptive right, the first monopoly of claims, in other words, to start mining the moon and asteroids, as some people on the left have argued to do. Trump has elevated US belligerence to cosmic levels in order to colonize space. Again, such behavior is not without precedent. The doctrine of discovery, codified in federal case law in the Johnson v. McIntosh 1823 decision, granted European powers preemptive rights to entire continents and nations of people. The 15th century papal decree divided the planet between the European Christian and non-Christian nations, permitting the former unrestricted access to the lands, resources, labor, and souls of the latter, the people of Africa and the Americas. The historical consequences of which later informed what W.E.B. Du Bois defined as the problem of the 20th century, the problem of the color line, the struggle between the lighter and darker nations, a problem in the 21st century delineated by the richer and poorer nations. The present global division of humanity concerns those who live with war and suffering and those who live in nations that perpetuate it. A system not only divided by racial and imperial designs, but enshrined by them. And at the center of our current conflagration is the United States. And I think it's important to situate the US, especially US imperialism, within this kind of longer arc of struggle. But before I continue, I want to respond to some of the things that Joshua had said. I don't disagree with Joshua at all, but I would like to maybe provide some historical context to the blockade as tactic and the blockade as strategy and as camp. And I would say that blockades actually predate the historical examples that you gave. So for example, Sitting Bull had blockaded the construction of the North Pacific Railroad in, I think it was in the 1870s, or no, excuse me, it was in the 1860s. And this was actually near the site of the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle, right? It was actually in Bismarck. And so infrastructure struggles, he actually set up a camp there, and actually where he set his camp up became the northern boundary for the Standing Rock Indian Reservation later on. But also in 1917 and 1918, the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe had created somewhat of a blockade to prevent the influx of outsiders coming in from the state of South Dakota, because at that time there was a flu pandemic, which has been miscategorized as the Spanish flu. And today we understand the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe again is leading a blockade against the state itself. And also the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe under the leadership of Harold Fraser had its own camp at Standing Rock as well. So it's important to understand that this isn't the camp didn't, just because the camp was evicted, it didn't end. And also there were other sort of generations of, there was also the production of different sort of camp things. And one of our comrades here who helps actually coordinate our mutual aid every week made the comment that Standing Rock had prepared us for the pandemic. So I thought that was an interesting kind of comparison. But I think the primary thing that I want to talk about is thinking about caretaking, especially land defense and water protection, as a form of labor that is increasingly becoming criminalized. And if we look at history, we can often see revolutionary movements by reading the law, especially criminology. If we think of figures such as George Jackson or Malcolm X, for example, they were criminalized because they were considered surplus people who had engaged, in criminal activity, but nonetheless led, in my opinion, were the thinkers, the vanguard thinkers of a international proletarian revolution on a world scale, right? And I would say that's very much the case of indigenous land defenders in this particular moment as increased criminalization happens. So similar to how women and non-men have been historically tasked with doing the unpaid labor of housework and child rearing, the relationship indigenous caretakers have with the land, water, air, and non-human world is typically not viewed as productive or in the realm of the so-called formal economy, right? So the financial, service, industrial, or technology sectors usually define what counts as a job as something that's frequently bound up with the extractive industries or polluting, and rarely is indigenous caretaking defined as work. Yet, like unwaged caregiving work, land defense and water protection are undervalued but necessary for the continuation of life on a planet teetering on collapse. So despite preserving the very elements needed to sustain life, such as clean air, water, and land from settler states, repression against indigenous peoples, protecting their territories runs rampant. And we can see this, this fight kind of escalating right now between the state of South Dakota and the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe and the Oglala Sioux tribe. The Oglala Sioux tribe actually effectively banned the governor of South Dakota, Kristi Noem, from the reservation after she pushed legislation that was basically drafted by TC Energy, formerly TransCanada, the current builders of the Keystone XL pipeline, through the state legislature, right? And it was effectively criminalizing the act of protest. And so many see the current blockades that are against the taking down of checkpoints, health checkpoints on the reservation, as a prelude of what's to come, right? The construction on the Keystone XL pipeline has already begun. And we're seeing kind of a ramping up of, or escalation of tensions, right? So in many ways, the caretaking economy is already in place. 3/4 of land-based environments and 2/3 of marine environments have been affected by capitalist development, but environmental degradation has been less severe in places managed by indigenous peoples and local communities. A recent UN report found, while making up only 5% of the world's population, indigenous peoples also protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. Indigenous peoples and local communities who have distinct cultural and social ties to ancestral homelands and bioregions still caretake at least 1/4 of the world's land area. And I say this partly because there's this new thesis coming around about half-earth socialism, which is pretty much just settler colonial politics, where they want to remove rural people from wild environments and to allow these carbon sinks to regrow. It's a very bizarre thesis, but it's important to remember that indigenous people are the first and primary caretakers of these lands in large areas. So this includes places that are the lungs of the world, such as the Amazon rainforest and its veins, like the Missouri River Basin. Areas facing existential threats of deforestation, damming, water contamination, oil and gas development, and mining. Indigenous people protect the land and air and water we all need to live. And this is why, indigenous land defenders are so severely criminalized and targeted throughout the world. And if you look specifically at the legislation that's coming out, and you can look at something like the American Legislative Exchange Council to understand how the sort of right or the state itself is very intersectional in understanding that land defense is deeply connected with the Black freedom movement, the abolitionist movement. It's deeply connected with voters' rights. It's deeply connected with the BDS movement, because ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, has created draft legislation criminalizing all four things: BDS, the standard ground laws that were created and first kind of drafted in states like Florida, but then also voter suppression, and then critical infrastructure bills. And as we know, new legislation proposed by Trump would make inhibiting the operation of an oil pipeline, such as simply standing in the way of construction, an offense punishable with 20 years in prison. So where does this leave us? I want to, before I make my concluding remarks, I want to point to something that Glenn brought up earlier about how the kind of historic indigenous land defense struggles had always kind of seen themselves within an international realm. One thing that I didn't talk about in my book, and I regret not talking about it, it's actually, I removed it from a chapter because it didn't quite fit, is the connections and the level of consciousness that a lot of water protectors had around the question of Venezuela. So for example, on the ground, you can rewatch Democracy Now! Videos, interviews with somebody like Winona LaDuke, who's on the front line talking about how the criminalization or the creation of these oil pipelines, such as the Dakota Access Pipeline, were a direct response to the sanctions against Venezuela. And as some of you may know, the increase of oil production domestically within the United States skyrocketed under Obama with the creation of the so-called fracking revolution. So that was about 70%, right? And a lot of those efforts were actually efforts to kind of choke out the Venezuelan economy. And so indigenous land defenders actually saw a direct correlation to the sanctions against Venezuela. Many indigenous people had openly identified with the Bolivarian Revolution So, for example, I actually became familiar with it when Citgo filled up our heating tank in the middle of a winter one year on the reservation. So we saw these things as kind of like connected with the imperialist relations of the United States to other kind of third world countries, but also specifically to socialist movements. So I guess I'll just end there and open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And I'm just going to throw it to Michael.
Good. Thanks, Sarah. And I also want to thank Phil and Sean and everyone working on Red May. Glenn and Nick and Joshua had offered important political arguments. I want to try something different, partly because I know that Red May has a certain tolerance for theoretical reflection. So I wanted to think briefly about the concept of circulation and in the context of circulation struggles. So let me go back first, and then I can get to circulation struggles in relation to others. What I wanted to start with was Marx's thinking in volume 2 of Capital. So in volume 1, he is focused on production almost exclusively. In volume 2, he starts out in the first section with 3 circuits, and each of these circuits is working through production, circulation, and consumption. He has 3 circuits which go, one in which moves from production to consumption, where circulation is the mediating factor. The next goes from circulation through to production, where consumption is the mediating factor. It sort of goes with each one in line. And one thing that these 3 circuits are meant to show are the natural points of crisis within the cycle of capitalist production. In other words, if you look at it from one perspective, say starting with production, you can see the crises that result from overproduction. Look at another from a different point, you can see the crises that result from hoarding or from underconsumption, etc. So in some ways, he's looking at the relationship among production, circulation, and consumption, partly to reveal these crises. Okay, but Marx's point in this, and where he ends up is that we must achieve a standpoint of total social capital, not the perspective of production or of circulation or of consumption, but rather of the entire circuit, something like that. Total social capital, by which he means, the total part is one recognizing both production, circulation, and consumption. The social part is that it's not from the perspective of one capitalist, but rather the entire capitalist class, social in that sense. So in some ways, what he's getting at here, at least with the total part, this might be just an easier formulation for it. I was thinking it's very like a point that Deborah Cowan makes in her book about logistics, when she says that the end of the production line is at the point where the consumer actually puts the product to use. In other words, Deborah's she's thinking about, it's not that production ends when the commodity is made. It doesn't even end when it's transported to the consumer. It's in fact, Joshua's already shaking his head about this. It actually ends when consumption is completed. Okay, so I'm thinking that's one way of understanding what Marx is trying to get at by seeing a perspective larger than either production, circulation, or consumption, or a priority on any of those 3. So I wanted to bring that then to the question that we're dealing with here about circulation struggles. Because I think we do often think separately of production struggles, work stoppages, circulation struggles, transport stoppages, other sorts of social stoppages, consumer struggles, boycotts like BDS, and what Marx probably didn't think of, but should be another category, I would say, would be reproduction struggles. Now, to go back, it seems to me that to try to take Marx's perspective about total social capital, rather than looking at one sphere or another as primary, it would rather be to think at the level of strategy of these different struggles and see these different types of struggles as tactical variants. Or another way of saying it is that activists use the means at hand. Yeah, let me try a couple examples, and then I'll stop, which might be the a good thing to do to pass on to other people. Like one example with this for me is the Piqueteros movement in Argentina around the currency crisis in 2001. And the Piqueteros is, I mean, they were unions of the unemployed. So in some way, it was a union movement, but a union of the unemployed. Since they didn't have, of course, a workplace and couldn't operate a work stoppage, they picketed, so they can't picket their own factory. They instead picketed the city. And so stopping the city. So you might say the Piqueteros were a circulation struggle, but in some ways it's a cross between a production struggle and a circulation struggle. And I guess my point is that rather than being one or the other, they're using the opportunity at hand to operate the stoppage of capital. Okay, here's another example. I guess it's another example of, I think, what would be called a circulation struggle, but I want to see it somewhat differently. This is from a book by Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward in the 1970s, Poor People's Movements. And they're trying to talk about the weapons of the poor. And at this point, they say that some of the poor are so isolated from significant institutional participation, partly that many of the poor aren't employed or aren't regularly employed. They continue that the only contribution they can withhold is that of quiescence in civil life. And then they say they can riot. But I think that this withholding, like all of these struggles, are forms of withholding. So the strike, of course, is a production withholding. Circulation struggles we've been talking about are a social withholding. Consumer struggles like BDS are a consumption withholding in many ways. But that the form that the withholding takes seems to me is less important than the general strategy. So in some ways, I guess what I'm looking for here is to think, as Marx is trying to think at the level of total social capital, I'm trying to think these as rather as tactics within a strategy of anti-capitalist struggle, and therefore not to see it at the level of distribution or circulation, but instead raised up to another level so that it can see the coordination among these various struggles all within the same optic. Okay, perhaps a useless theoretical formulation, but there you have it. I'll pass it on to the next. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. And all right, that means Phil's up.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks to all the Red May organizers, to Sean, to Kyle, to the other Phil. I am going to be talking I'm a geographer, and I'm going to be talking about geography. I'm going to be talking about the geography of kind of global circulation. But really, when we talk about global circulation, we're also talking in many ways kind of about production. I'll go into a little bit more detail about what I mean in that regard in a second. But I want to talk about these spaces of circulation that are a little bit beyond the normal kind of urban kind of core that a lot of politics focuses on. One portion of that is the what I call the far hinterland. So when I'm talking about the hinterland, I'm talking about the hinterland of capital. So this area that's kind of beyond the core, or is portrayed as being beyond kind of the core of that urban city center. The far hinterland is an area that's really marked by what you might think of as long distance kind of circulation. So think of it as long kind of lines or strands of capital accumulation that's being transited through things like pipelines or roads, so freight haulage on roads or rail lines, or ocean shipping. In this far hinterland, one thing that tends to happen over time is that you start to see a gradual kind of abandonment of a lot of labor-intensive forms of production. So if you look at agriculture, if you look at mining, the labor-intensive quality of those has tended to decrease over time, which also means that the people directly employed in those areas and in those industries has also fallen. But that doesn't always lead to just out-migration from these areas. A lot of the far hinterland is what we would characterize as rural, but it's not exclusively rural. We have to remember that the hinterland is the hinterland of capital, which doesn't mean that it's just the hinterland of a given city. It could also be something like a city that has been abandoned by capital, a city that's fallen into a rust belt, such as in northeastern China or in Detroit in the US. These kind of classic examples of a rust belt are also basically characterized in this same fashion. So when we talk about the far hinterland, what we're really talking about is an area that's kind of distant from those central circuits of capital accumulation. And it's marked by extraction, long distance transit, and very, very low levels of employment, not just in productive activity, however you might define that, but just in general. Very high unemployment, very low levels of formal employment, and then there's even kind of low and inconsistent levels of black market employment. When people are in those sort of situations, what do you do to make a living? Well, you do black market stuff, you do gray market stuff, you do all kinds of weird, odd jobs, all kinds of informal labor. But you're also dependent on what are kind of in the Marxist sense called rents. And rents in this idea of the term is not like just a land rent that's paid. It's also something like, how tax funds get distributed, how basically like interest taken off of payday loans, for example, is something of a similar character, or direct forms of extraction, like all the when you deploy a police department to go fine everybody in a town, usually according to racial lines, and then you're using those fines to pay for the city government, essentially. So you get this virtuous circle in which you're basically just robbing people to pay for the city government that is robbing people. So you see that sort of thing, especially in these far hinterland zones. That creates the illusion, I want to point out, that these are quote unquote neo-feudal relations. That's absolutely not the case. This is classic old school, like orthodox, what Marx actually wrote Marxism. It's what capitalism does. It's kind of what it's always done, and it's the core of those long-term trends in capitalism. These are also areas where when you see circulation struggles, they either take this form that's been discussed kind of extensively, and I won't add to, because I think everyone else has done a great job talking about it, and they're more qualified to talk about these blockades and anti-pipeline struggles and that sort of thing. The other thing that it leads to, though, are kind of these weird anti-rent struggles, not in the sense of like rent strike, but in the sense of like anti-taxation, anti-federal oversight, anti-government employment, all of that. And that takes on a more right-wing character in these areas. And so that's why you see the emergence of like far-right militias, and they play this kind of weird role in those locations. In addition to that far hinterland space, though, you also have what I call the near hinterland. And this is kind of a weirder but much more important geography. So when we're talking about the reshaping of global kind of production and the emergence of these circulation or logistics networks, we're really talking about the restructuring of fundamentally productive networks. And we're not just talking about the movement of goods from point A to B, but we're also talking about, for example, the partial processing of goods all along that line. So I don't want people to think of this just as warehouses and transit and shipping. It also involves like actual kind of materials production and all the other things that we've kind of been talking about, exclusion from the economy as well. These areas in the near hinterland really kind of condense around urban cores, but are not what most people think of when they think of the city. They think of the city as kind of this downtown built up area. This core has finance, insurance, real estate, employment, a lot of what are called producer services, the things that in the 90s, everyone started calling global cities. And then in the 2000s, everyone started saying, oh, well, the creative class is attracted to these sort of places. And really the form that politics took almost exclusively in many of those years, aside from the normal and recently increasing protests against police violence was also just kind of general anti-gentrification politics in these areas because of that sort of development. But what was really not getting addressed until much more recently is these near hinterland areas that are just outside that urban core. So these are suburban areas largely. In some places they're a little more exurban where you kind of phase into the far hinterland, but really we're talking about what are called inner ring suburbs. And those are areas which have seen a rapid and substantial demographic flip in many US cities where they used to be predominantly like white working class suburbs in like that old school baby boomer sense. And now they are in many cities in the US hyper diverse, the highest rates of poverty in many areas. Seattle, the Twin Cities, Washington, DC, Atlanta are all kind of the real case in point for this idea. But you really see it almost everywhere in different ways. And these near hinterland zones are areas where you kind of have this disavowed core of production. Instead of that thin line of circulation, you have kind of dense nodes that interconnect with each other. And there's a lot of much more kind of central nodes as well, things like ports where if they're shut down, substantial parts of the economy get shut down. Major freight lines operate in a similar fashion, and substantial kind of concentrated warehouses like big shipping centers or big air shipping centers at big airports like freight airports. In these areas, you tend to see something different in terms of the struggles that arise in those locations. So there's two main things that have been happening in those areas recently, and they haven't really overlapped substantially, but my money's on the 2020s for them overlapping because everything is kind of pointing in that direction very strongly. The first is your classic kind of circulation struggles among logistics workers. So Amazon workers going on strike, for example. There's been a lot of that in a lot of different respects, and it takes different forms in different cities. That has tended to dominate in cities that are still relatively kind of like not necessarily entirely wealthy, but kind of wealthier and have more of a booming kind of logistics kind of center to them. The other thing that's been happening though are suburban riots against police violence. And that's largely been in cities that are a little bit more where they have maybe this combination of kind of a far hinterland abandoned Rust Belt character and suburbanization of poverty. And so that's a city like St. Louis and Ferguson being the first kind of major suburban riot in recent US history. Finally, I'll just point out that this is a trend that really is kind of pushing the US back to the global norm in many ways of what you see almost everywhere else in the world of kind of poorer working class suburbs surrounding a wealthier urban core. And for the US, there's just historical reasons why that hasn't always been the case. But yeah, we'll, I'm sure, talk about some of this a little bit more in the questions.
Okay, and again, last but definitely not least, Camila, all you.
Thank you, Sarah. I want to thank Phil for the invitation. I am thrilled to be here. And I want to talk about the last struggles in Chile, where I'm from. So this is a core circulation struggle, what happened in Chile. As I think you might know, it started in the 18th of October last year, 2019. There was an increase of 30 pesos, a very small increase in the metro fare. And the high school students organized a form of resistance. It was a form of civil disobedience. And the strategy was to evade the fare, and they called for a massive fare evasion. And basically it was about using the transport as a way to protest the social conditions, material conditions of the population that had been decreasing through the 30 years in democracy. The students called for this, and the idea of the fare evasion and the motto was fare evasion, another form of struggle. And the idea is that you don't need to really protest all style. You can actually pass, jump the turnstile, and go. And and this way you can escape the police in a way. You are putting yourself on the line, but you are moving. So you are a moving target, if you will. So and this way, high school students. So what happened, and I see this as a kind of the dialectic of action and reaction, and how the state reacts to the provocations of the students. They send, of course, the police to stop the fare evasion, even though the metro is it's a hybrid, it's partially privatized. So basically we use the police force in order to police the fare, which is also something that is done in New York. Even if this is not a crime, it's just something that you can pay a fee and that's it. However, because of the smartphones, we saw a lot of police arresting and maltreating high school students. And of course, the videos exploded, went viral, and therefore the older folk and the parents and grandparents of these kids came out in mass. And there was this massive kind of a struggle that started as marches, as the kind of old classical Latin American way of protesting. And it at the end ended up in the occupation of Plaza Italia, which is the kind of downtown Santiago. And it's always been kind of a bastion and kind of a very important place. And this space was is crucial because there is a rotunda that connects together the kind of uptown and downtown. So people occupied this square and they renamed the square. Instead of Plaza Italia, they rename it Plaza Dignidad, the Dignity Square. And every afternoon, but especially every Friday after that outburst of protest and repression by the state, people started occupying the square and paralyzing the city. And the idea of blockading the circulation of the city in order to raise awareness was central to the movement. And the majority of people were, and the discussion was about the proper way of discussing and the proper way of protesting. The idea of blockading was understood by the elites as violence in itself. And the idea that if they want to protest, why don't they go to the fringes and they protest in the periphery and they basically don't bother anybody? And the idea of that you cannot, cutting transit is going against your human rights to mobility in a way. And this is what the discussion was in the elite circle. And this movement was very interesting because it started from this fare evasion, but it immediately connected to other previous struggles for free education, for the pension systems, which is privatized. And of course, as you may know, Chile is the ground zero for neoliberalism. It was the first time that the package of neoliberal reforms was applied. It was applied in dictatorship, so it was a perfect environment for this radical reforms to be applied because you had no pushback. Actually, within 1982, we had the debt crisis and poverty just went off the roof. It was 40-something%, almost 50% of the population in 1988. Of course, the data is always sketchy when we're in dictatorship, but we saw that the brunt of all the costs were borne by the working classes, and there was a massive poverty. But then it adjusted, and we came to democracy. And the idea is that democracy came with hand in hand with progress, and the idea that we are going to partake in the progress of capitalism. And this was fulfilled, as Phil was saying, a kind of a new way of dependence. This was fulfilled through credit, loans. And basically, we didn't have a middle class, and the middle class was created on loans, on credits. And today, the average household pays 75% of their income in paying debts to the banks. So this is kind of a fake middle class that it hasn't been hollowed out like in the US, but it actually never existed. It's just kind of built on air, on credit. And of course, credit is the payment of the credits are hinged on labor. So the moment that you lose your job, everything comes crumbling down. And because Chile has a model of a subsidiary state, so the idea of the role of the state after the huge privatizations in the 80s was to subsidize capital, was to subsidize private industry in the giving social services. So in Chile, the majority of social services are either completely privatized or importantly, part of them are privatized. So therefore, and they're paid by labor. So if you don't have a job, you don't have health care, and you don't have a decent pension, you don't have all the things that are attached to labor. So the moment there is starting a recession that started last year, it started very slowly, and kind of like this this struggle of the high school students just kind of coalesced and came everything together. It ended up in asking the state, or demanding the state for a constituent process. Because in Chile, neoliberalism was not just a package of reforms, but actually was constitutionalized. And it was designed in a manner that would not be, cannot be dismantled. So one example is all the public industry was privatized in the 80s. And then there was an article that was passed in the Constitution that says that basically if the state wants to engage in any economic activity, needs to have a majority in both houses of Congress and needs to be basically rubber stamped. And that is something that is almost impossible. So basically the state retrenched to the minimum, and then it was put a blockade in order to intervene. So today we have pensions that are 3 times below the extreme poverty line. So we have one of the highest rates of senior suicides in Chile. So the majority of people committing suicide are the people 80 and up, because they don't have anything. So the pension system was created to develop a capital market, but not really to give good pensions. And we have kind of gotten to the end of the line of this, and this kind of very precarious middle class or lower middle class, the social mobility paid through loans have come to kind of an end. And today, this struggle couldn't end. The state wanted to wait it out, because this is very difficult for people to everybody to get out on Fridays and occupy this space. And it was a very interesting dynamic of strategies. There was a front line created, because and the rest of the people protesting with like children and families. So basically the front line, there was like this mask heroes. They were holding the line of the cops with rubber bullets and with pellets and the water guns and the water cannons. And then basically the first line was contending this kind of pushing back so that people could protest in peace. And this was the idea that you can there is a kind of on and off and power struggle between the blockading of specific of the center of capital, if you will, and the idea that you can really paralyze the city, and the push of the government to keep circulation going. So after all these months of protest, the corona crisis hit, and the government said, well, now you need to all go home. And the protests, of course, subsided. And now the people are in partial quarantines. And talking about circulation, Chile had this wonderful idea of having dynamic quarantines that were decided every other week. And they shifted not on health goals, but in economic goals. And today we have one of the worst rates of contagion of the world. So the president allowed the opening of shopping malls in the middle of the crisis. So now it's weird because the people are asking for the quarantine. So they are demanding quarantine, the stopping of circulation from the state, because they know that the people that are doing the circulation and the distribution of basic resources are people from the lower classes that today do not have employment, because one of the the legal strategies of the state in order to preserve employment, and very similar to the US, if they pass a law in order to allow employers to not pay wages, only if they pay their social security tax. So what happened, and of course this was geared to very small companies, but immediately H&M, Starbucks, they already did it. And of course they didn't have to pay wages. So you have a swath of people from the lower classes and the working classes immediately out of work. And today we have these struggles for social services have become the struggles for food. So today we have hunger riots today. And this again, we go back to the idea of circulation, and weirdly enough, our government, that is a right-wing government, instead of giving money to people, decided, giving a little bit of cash, they decided to give food aid. And this is a challenge of distribution in the middle of the pandemic, to actually target these people. So there's all this kind of like a struggle, who is controlling the circulation and who is controlling the blockade. Thank you.
Thank you all. That was great. So we have some audience questions. You can keep putting those in, and Sean will keep feeding those to me. And most of these have been addressed to a specific person, but I think all of you might have some things to say about some of them. So I'm going to address them to whoever they were addressed to first, and then let anybody else who wants to jump in have a shot. So the first question is for Nick. And our questioner wants to know if you can talk more about the Cheyenne River tribe's health checkpoints, and in the context of if this is what Mike Davis is calling an age of pandemics, will we start to see more of this kind of land defense? And what does this tell us about how the left should organize about health security?
Yeah, so
Cool question.
I guess oh, sorry, do I go?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So I guess the short answer to that is there's two approaches throughout the world to the pandemic, and there's the science-based approach, and there is the hallucination-based approach. And we can make the argument that the United States is, full of hallucinations about what it's doing in response to the coronavirus. However, if you read the letters that were written by both Chairman Julian Bear Runner for the Oglala Sioux Tribe, but then also Harold Frazier for Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, they make a very compelling argument to say that because the state has failed to shut down, South Dakota is one of, I think, 6 states, that has, because of US exceptionalism, has immunity to coronavirus. But this was around the time that there was a Morel meat packing plant and slaughterhouse in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, that had around, I think it was about 500 of the 1,000 employees there got infected. And one thing that wasn't being talked about, people think of South Dakota and they think of white people, but the people who are working in these meatpacking plants, many of them are undocumented or don't have papers. Many of them are migrant workers, specifically from East Africa. So those were the kinds of people who were considered, expendable workers. And they, most of them didn't live in the kind of core of Sioux Falls, because of, just it was expensive to live, and many of them lived in rural environments. So this was a direct response to that. And I think that the tribes acted in good faith in the sense that they let the state of South Dakota know that this was happening. And the state of South Dakota was their response is really fascinating, because they basically said, well, we're gonna shut down the blockades, and the Republican lawmakers actually in the state were actually like, you actually can't do that because you have no authority. And so the response from the governor was to actually call in the feds, the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is really fascinating because it's an admission that the state has no authority. So it was kind of a weird win on that sense. But then the Democratic and Republican kind of leadership in the state has now allied together and wants a full kind of investigation of these blockades. It's basically like an upper level, or like a scaled up version of Karen's calling the cops on people, right? They try to find, like if you read these letters, they're like trying to find out who's in charge here, I think that these are kind of an example of where we're heading here in this state where I'm from, Albuquerque, or where I'm living right now in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is colonized Tiwa territory. The tribes have been very proactive in the sense that they shut down their reservations, prior to any kind of mass scale response on behalf of the state itself. But because this is a democratic controlled state, because the oil and gas industry is considered an essential part of the economy, these oil and gas workers were still going into the reservation, right? They weren't restricted. They couldn't be restricted by the tribes because of a patchwork jurisdiction. So you have tribal land next to federal land next to state land, and so while the kind of democratic leadership in the state was patting itself on the back, rates of infection rapidly increased in the reservation areas. And instead of closing down like, hiking trails and parks that are all surrounding reservation land, right, because it's not considered quote unquote developed, it's considered expendable, or it's considered nature reserves, white people just flocked into the reservations despite the orders that they weren't supposed to by tribes asking nicely, right? And we also saw local law enforcement protesting alongside of Nazi flags that were made out of the Zia symbol, which is a sacred symbol to the Zia Pueblo tribe and is actually the state flag. The cops were actually protesting alongside of these ostensible like white supremacists. So there's been kind of this interesting alignment, and I think something is about, something is going to break here, because the simple fact of the matter is the people who are most impacted by the coronavirus here in this state are Native people. We make up about less than 11% of the population, but now we're more than 50% of the infections, and we have I think it's equal on to the levels of death as well. So I think at the end of this, we're going to see an escalation between not just the state and the tribes, but the tribes, and the way that the federal government has basically sacrificed indigenous nations for the oil and gas industry on one hand, but then also the belligerence of trying to open up reservation lands.
Did anybody else want to jump in on any of that before I take the next question? Good. All right, so our next question was for Michael, but also anybody can feel free to answer that after I let Michael have first crack at it. The question is, how would you envision struggles in the consumption sphere beyond BDS? Are there any other examples you can think of? And the questioner wants to know, in your account, is veganism a consumption struggle?
Veganism certainly could be. I mean, depends on how it's done, but we have a long history of boycotts, boycotts of white business in the Black community. We have the boycotts of Coca-Cola during decades around their achievements. So, I mean, there's a long history of boycotts. What I'm, and hence struggles that you could place in the realm of consumption. What I'm more interested in is, and perhaps I'm not yet at the point to be able to propose it in a coherent way, is not thinking about circulation struggles or production struggles or consumption struggles, but thinking of them all as tactics or variants within a larger conception in which they all fit. That's what that's what I was trying to do, or trying to think through my discomfort with our focus here on circulation struggles. But in any case, to answer the question, because that wasn't the question at all. The answer to the question, I do think consumption struggles can be important as boycotts, and right, there's certainly plenty of historical examples of them. I'll stop with that.
Anybody else? Joshua?
Just add something to that, which is, I don't think this is a response directly to that question so much as the context of that question, because I think it's an important one, not least because boycotts and sort of kinds of what got called for a while conscious consumption and so on have played a big role for people in their imagining their political lives in various ways. And I think it's important to make an account of that. I think there's like two different ways to think about why we're talking about circulation struggles in the first place, right? One is because there's some idea that they're cool or better or the right kind of struggle, or that we're advocating for them, in which case Michael's advisory to take a step back and see all struggles as part of a larger struggle, how they relate to each other, is very well taken, right? But there's another way to formulate it, which is, why have we seen a dramatic historical shift in the Western world from one kind of struggle to another? And I know Sarah, who's one of our greatest labor journalists and labor thinkers, will be a little riled by this, right? But the historical labor movement, as is understood from 1875 into the 1970s, doesn't really exist anymore. There's still a very active labor movement, but it's the way that that oriented all left politics for much of the world, especially the Western white world, that has really shifted and declined. And we've seen this thing we're calling circulation struggles increasingly present. So this gets back to Nick's really important point that things like circulation struggles, indigenous blocking of infrastructure has a long tradition. But there's a real question of like when that kind of struggle becomes like the leading form, the kind of form that people can look at and go like, yeah, that's what's going on. And there's a reason for that, right? And thinking about the reason that the ways people have struggled, the orienting ways, the most common ways, and so on, have shifted historically. That's sort of one of our obligations, right? Not to sit here and say, here's the right kind of struggle. I really don't mean to do that, but to think about the historical trajectory, why things have changed as they have. I see Michael looking up angularly, although his co-authored book Empire is in many ways about this exact question. And to try and trace that out and understand what direction we might be headed, and what struggles really seem to be grasping the horns of the dilemma, which is why I wanted to turn to pipeline struggles as an example, not because they're brand new, but because they're doing a more and more important thing. And I think they're getting broader and broader support, I hope, among people. And so it's a question of historical change over time, not over advocacy or something like that.
As you know, I don't entirely disagree with you on that. I think one of the points that I would make in conversation with both of you here is that we're seeing where the labor movement still manages to have power. It's usually in places where it intersects with things like circulation struggles. There's a reason everybody's talking about Amazon workers. And once again, it's not because there are that many Amazon workers going on strike. There have been some, and I'm very excited about it, but it continues to sort of be overstated in numbers. But because it's incredibly significant as a place to withdraw labor. And also, of course, the history, when Michael was talking about boycotts, the first thing that I think of course, is the Cesar Chavez and the farm workers and the Great Boycott. That was, these are undertaken to give workers more power when they withdraw their labor. So anybody else want to jump in now that I've taken moderator's privilege? Anyone? I've got more questions, so. Yeah, okay. All right, so our next question is to Glen, and this is a little bit more specific, so I don't think anybody else can share on this one, but you said that Bobby Seale considered NARP's political program a universal program. Could you say more about that appeal to universality, and what do you see as some universal political formations coming in the 21st century? You're still on mute, Glen. Need to turn your volume back on. There you are.
Hear me? He was referencing the uptake by a number of kind of different revolutionary groups of the 10-point program of the Panthers. So one of the interesting things around this was the universality of it came from the fact that there wasn't even though it was written specifically with the objectives and material conditions understood as emanating or representative of the Black community in the U.S. To start with in California, that it immediately kind of started to get taken up by other more particularities, and that included NARP. So the thing that I think that is interesting with it is the way in which an organization like NARP takes what Seale characterized as a universal position, but then reads it through and adapts it or modifies it through the lens of land and place. So this is, I think, from my understanding in the conversations that I've had with folks, was one of the kind of global, sometimes ill-informed, sometimes very theoretically informed uptakes of something like Maoism, was the fact that that was kind of built into it, at least as a theoretical sort of rhetoric and then animating practice. So I don't know what I probably would have to think about how these universalities might project themselves into the future. But the interesting thing for me is like the interplay between the like place and something more macro and broader, and how those translate across disparate struggles in ways that don't foreclose in an identitarian sort of politics sort of way. Common ground, cross-fertilization, and meaningful collaboration.
Anybody else want to comment on that? It makes me think, I was just saying to somebody before this about the way that, you know, you hear some on the left argue that you have to have like totally universal programs because otherwise the normies won't get it. And yet Minneapolis is the thing on my social media feeds that has crossed over into people that I know from other places. And I think that's a really interesting connection there, the way that the Black Panther program was understandable and applicable to other struggles, even though people were not specifically Black Americans coming from Oakland. And people still recognize the struggles for justice, the struggles for equality, the struggles for access to things as something they can relate to. So that makes me jump a couple questions in a line, because somebody did ask for any and all of you who would like to speak more specifically to the situation in Minneapolis right now through this the perspective that we've been talking about here about circulation struggles, reproductive struggles. So I don't know who to pick on to go first on this one, although anyone?
Well, part of the reason why I'm like telling this story out of is the fact that it's like really points to an important convergence of where these struggles align, where we can speak across the specificity of different struggles and how they like violently enact themselves in our lives and communities, but still come up with a politics of solidarity that speaks to both the specificity and the kind of broader violences at play. So this becomes like less of a theoretical question, because I don't think we've theoretically done a very good job of it across our various communities, and to point to histories where these relations of co-resistance and kind of radical empathy like have amounted to both locally and globally, like very, very tangible material relationships of support, but also an intellectual kind of cross-fertilization that gives us a better grasp on our fucking moment. So I think that like these organizers during this period were quite open to that, because it was so grounded in the very specific locations of place and land, that it gives me hope that that we can continue to do that and escalate it in scale.
Yeah.
If I could say something.
Yeah.
What strikes me about this is that there's not only circulation of struggles, but also circulation of the repertoires of repression. Because when I saw the movement and how it was repressed, it was the same as it was in Chile. And we thought that it was only kind of in Latin America, third world, you know, you have rubber bullets, you have massive amounts of tear gas that actually is toxic and you can actually die there. You know, water cannons that are so strong that you can fall to the ground and break bones. This is how the police actually there is a circulation of how to repress. So, for example, Chile is very connected to Israel and Colombia. So how do they repress, and how did this kind of special squads? And now you can see the repression here is the highly militarized police, and what has become acceptable. Before, it was not really acceptable in this last 20 years to actually repress people like this. Today, it's out in the open and it's being normalized. So it is not only the struggles that are kind of having a community, but also the community of the state pushing back against these struggles. So there are two things that we need to learn here, I think.
I think it's worth,
Nick? Yeah.
yeah, I think it's worth even talking about the history of Minneapolis. There's a good book called Settler City Limits, and there's a chapter on Minneapolis and Minneapolis policing that you should all check out to talk about how, I forgot the author, I really apologize. Settler City Limits is the title of the book, but I think it's important to talk about the rise of the Red Power movement. And most people place it as something that, you know, as often Indigenous people are imagined as being, you know, somewhere else and not in the city, in the urban area. But I think, like, even what Camila was bringing up earlier, it's important to even contextualize the uprising in Chile as being preceded by Mapuche blockades in the south and the extensive organizing. I was actually in Venezuela when I was in Venezuela at the time that the protests in Chile were really picking up, and there's some Mapuche comrades there who were just giving me the entire lowdown about everything, the social movements. Many of them were from the city. So I think there's this tendency, and it's part of erasure, to even think about in the United States or even in so-called Canada, that Indigenous people only do things on the land, right? And the land is somewhere elsewhere, and it's not in the city. But if you look at a place like the United States, like 70% of Native people don't live on reservations, they live in cities. So when we talk about like organizing and land defense, we actually begin with the city as Indigenous space, right here in Tiwa territory. And so too did the Red Power activists. The Native National Indian Youth Council, under sort of the leadership of Clyde Warrior, who actually was here at this university. I'm at work right now. I'm not supposed to be, but they turned off the cooling system on me. So I'm gonna, if I start sweating, don't get weirded out. But so he coined the term Red Power, and he was in conversation with Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael. They weren't like, it wasn't like, oh, there's Black Power, then there's Red Power. It's like, no, there's Black Power and Red Power, right? They theorized it together, as far as I understand. And it wasn't a competition. It was actually like, how do these things complement each other? This was in like 1961, right? This was at a time when, speaking of blockades, the Red Power movement had very, had kind of perfected what were called fish-ins, where they would go and, they would go and fish and exercise treaty rights, specifically in the Northwest, but there were other occupations here in the Southwest. The Coalition for Navajo Liberation, who Melanie Yazzie writes about, did an armed takeover of the oil and gas fields and shut them down. And this was at the same time that the American Indian movement was happening, right? And so the American Indian movement tends to overshadow some of these other events, but they also weren't a competing kind of struggle. But at the same time, the Navajo Coalition for Navajo Liberation fought with the police in border towns like Farmington, New Mexico, after the Choke Cherry massacres, when white boys went around and mutilated Native, or specifically Navajo men on the streets, and took their fingers and their hands and their noses and their ears as souvenirs in the 70s. Native people didn't just like sit around and let this happen. They actually fought people in the streets. This was happening at the same time that the American Indian movement was first founded in a place like Minneapolis, responding directly, first and primarily, to the rampant police violence against Native people. They were inspired by the Black Panther Party, right? They were inspired by these Black Power movements that were happening at the same time. But not only that, they didn't just it wasn't just a response. They also began creating what were called survival schools in the cities, right? And these were schools that provided an alternative educational model. And if you watch some of these videos and these live streams, I've been watching them all day, of the riots that are happening in Minneapolis, you can see that the buildings that are destroyed are like AutoZones, Denny's, right? But the buildings that are quote unquote like saved, right, are spared, are like the libraries or the senior citizen homes. Like there's a calculation here. There's an understanding of what capitalism is, right? And it's playing out on the street. There's also an understanding of this kind of like historic settler occupation that's manifest in the violence of the police itself, both in the Black and Indigenous communities. And if you look at the history of the anti-police violence movement, just the recent history of the anti-police violence movement in Minneapolis, it's been very generative in the sense that it's like the Native movement and the Black movement, they're not seen as kind of like mutually exclusive struggles, but have been in conversation and have been like building struggle, and doing the peaceful protest and the sit-ins and the things like that. And this is when it all fails, right? This is what happens, right? When all those things go out of, when there's no long, when the state just does what the state does, right? So I think that's important to contextualize that particular history.
Yeah. And I would throw in the worker centers that organize in the Latino community in Minneapolis. So I have a question for Phil, which is great because I think you're the only one we haven't heard from on this round of Q&A yet. There has been a back and forth of capital investment from city to suburb and back again in the US. And the questioner wants to know if you can speak to how this process in the US compares to internationally.
Yeah, it kind of depends what we're talking about specifically when we're talking about kind of a back and forth. In some ways, there's kind of a back and forth. In other ways, when we're talking about specific industries, it's kind of just a fourth. Like you see some returns of capital investment in, for example, large real estate speculation or corporate complexes, headquarters for Amazon, et cetera, in like downtown urban cores. But the general trend in the US and elsewhere is normally toward kind of large scale productive facilities, which includes kind of big circulation centers and factories and all kinds of stuff like that, tend to get farther and farther from the urban core because it's cheaper and easier to do that, according to just basic logic of land cost. So if you are kind of fighting about where to open your factory, the greenfield location that's a little bit farther out is usually going to be more attractive unless there's something specific to a specific reason to locate it in a particular place. So in general, this is why you tend to see these rings of newer industry that kind of accrue at whatever the urban border currently is. These inner ring kind of suburbs, it depends on the size of the city. It kind of depends on what stage of growth it's in. But in general, that's the rule globally. This is the rule. This isn't just an American phenomenon. This is the rule. If you go to China, if you get like across the border from Hong Kong, you go into Shenzhen, that whole area like Shekou used to be all like factories and stuff. And then now it's kind of like the downtown, it's very developed. There's a bunch of like expat restaurants and stuff. And you have to go all the way to the end of the railroad line to go to the Foxconn factory, which is up at the very, very top of the city. And then it's also true, if you look at where the factories are in, I just got back from Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, looking at actually Chinese factories operating there. Those industrial areas are also out in these kind of suburban areas, like around the airport. There's a long strip of industry leading up to the airport in Dar es Salaam. And then out in like Mikocheni, which is up in like the north east of the city. Again, kind of this out of the way suburban area. Downtown is all real estate speculation, these large complexes for, big empty malls now, but kind of entertainment complexes and that sort of thing. That's basically the norm. Technically, that means that there's capital investment going on in both places. We're more talking about where's kind of this core, this hidden core, the hidden abode of production, as Marx says. Where is that? And it's in the suburbs.
Anybody else have any thoughts on that before so we are getting kind of late and all of you are wonderful. And I wanted to give you all a chance to add any last thoughts before we wrap up and I go to sleep because I go to bed early and I'm on the East Coast. So I guess we can just, Camila, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about bringing the Mapuche in. Which is how the state has been repressing these indigenous groups for decades. It has never stopped. And all these kind of repertoires of repression have been tested on the indigenous communities. And they have fought back. And because the indigenous population is around 10%, really is not something that we share, is not something that is kind of isolated, because during the dictatorship, their lands were privatized. So it's something kind of happening in the South, and there's state terrorism happening. But now that we have all this protests about material conditions that are more pervasive throughout the population, then we have the same repression inflicted on the population at large. So it's something that had been proven and perfected on the bodies of indigenous people, and now it is being inflicted in the body of everybody. And therefore, what is interesting is that if you see all the videos and the photos, is that the flag of the Mapuche nation has been included and superseded. It superseded the Chilean flag. And at the end, you can see the flags of the Mapuche there. And even though people are not identified with as indigenous, there is the idea of the sharing of the struggle that goes back to the struggle for land and kind of like the means of production. So that is very interesting.
Anybody? I'm going to start picking people. Come on, I know y'all have some last thing to say before we go.
I'll
Phil,
add
yeah.
something.
Yeah.
This actually kind of builds on something that Nick mentioned very briefly. And I talk about this in a little bit more detail with like the actual numbers in my book. But this is the fact that when a lot of people imagine these far hinterland, like rural spaces, like if you bring up what you think of as like South Dakota in your mind, a lot of people imagine these to be white spaces. And this is kind of where that image of like Trump country comes from, which itself is untrue for like a couple reasons. But one of the reasons is basically that a lot of rural areas in the US, in the far hinterland, they appear as kind of white spaces, in part because they're just more segregated. So all the kind of normal segregation measures increase kind of substantially when you're looking at urban areas, partially because of population density being low, et cetera, but also a lot of it has to do with particular histories of sequestering population in particular areas, whether it be farm workers, in one part of a city, or old Southern, cities that are built like it's white on one side of the train tracks and it's black on the other side of the train tracks, or if we're talking about the reservation system in the US. So a lot of what we kind of imagine when we look at these kind of far hinterland spaces, we imagine these kind of white spaces, but that's just not true across the board. And in many states, it's not true like whatsoever. So if we're looking at New Mexico, rural New Mexico is only about like 30% white or something like that. It's a very, very low number by comparison. What a lot of people kind of imagine is this sort of rurality that's kind of idealized from kind of like the Northeast, where you're really not that far from the city and you're really talking about exurbs, but you're sort of imagining that plus maybe like Wyoming or part of Wyoming, because you're probably not imagining all of Wyoming correctly.
I was hoping maybe just to say one brief thing before we go about Sonia Savage. Sonia Savage, if you're not familiar, is the energy minister of Alberta in Canada. And she recently was talking to the Canadian Association of Oil Well Drilling Contractors, as one does. And she said it was a great time to build oil pipelines because the coronavirus lockdowns are preventing large protests. It's really instructive, right? Which is to say, insofar as there's a we and a they, and I don't want to be too easy about this, right? I know that many of us have differences and we would want to talk them through, but insofar as there's a we and a they totally know what time it is, right? There's no mystery at all. Camila mentioned circulation of state strategies and knowledges and technologies of repression, and that's something to be aware of. They're entirely aware that like there will never again, in all of history, be a pipeline built that people don't try to stop. So having to figure out how they can pull it off and how a global catastrophe might be an opportunity for that to happen is the state's knowledge of the power of circulation struggles. And on that point, it's really worth reminding what became very clear when there was a call for solidarity actions from Indigenous people last year around West Suet and stuff, and they broke out across not just Canada, but other places in North America, in Turtle Island. And we were reminded, right, that it actually takes very few people to shut down a railroad track. I just want to like leave on that very simple tactical fact, is that it's great to do things en masse. It's great to have mass movements. It's great to have a lot of comrades. It's great to not feel alone out there, but it's also possible to shut down a railroad track with 6 people. And we saw that happen over and over again. And it's worth just bearing that in mind.
Anyone else? Nick, you look like you have something to say.
Yeah, I'll just a rejoinder to Joshua. I do agree that you don't need a lot of people to shut down a pipeline, but you need a lot of people. And I would say that even within, and maybe Glenn can speak to this a little bit, but even within the Wet'suwet'en Strong kind of hashtag movement that arose out of it, it was very much like Standing Rock in the sense that you saw it galvanize a lot of Indigenous communities. So there were many people participating in it, even if they weren't, in the blockades themselves. And that kind of gets me to the final point that I want to make and leave people with as well, is that, it's really great that, here in this city, there's, we're a little bit more developed in the sense that our mutual aid work there's probably about 100 people who are involved in it in some way or another. But the idea that mutual aid is this organic response to crises is really great. Everyone loves that. But really I see mutual aid, and even the organic response against pipelines in many ways, I see mutual aid as the kind of seed for scaling up these struggles that we want to actually build the long-term vision. Because I'm not just an academic, I'm somebody who actually participates in these movements. And I listen to the discussions, and the long-term vision is to actually build communes. To become, to enact food sovereignty, very much inspired by a lot of the work at Dechinta, the land-based kind of work that's happening up north, but actually trying to enact that in a city. And that's a very challenging and daunting kind of task. But I visited the communes in Venezuela and in Caracas specifically, and seeing how people are doing it there. They're not just 6 people. They're not just 6 well-meaning people who are doing Food Not Bombs. No offense against Food Not Bombs, but there are thousands, tens of thousands, and perhaps millions of them doing that. And that's what our goal is. And we understand that it has to be rooted in what we are calling Indigenous socialism, right? And in Indigenous traditions of resistance.
Thanks for that, Nick. I think just to get back to that question on Black and Indigenous solidarity and the importance of kind of relearning from the shoulders that we stand on. And then I said that theoretically we're not very good at solidarity, but in practice we're a lot better. One of the theoretical insights, I think, from the time that I was speaking of, like in the 60s transitioning into the long 70s, was understanding and recognizing and affirming the specificity of our struggles didn't amount to a political incommensurability, which I think is important, that sometimes we get trapped up in these days. But they were also theoretically working off of a different framework of understanding the US and Canadian race relations. It wasn't dominated by the language of settler colonialism, particularly kind of a very white settler colonialism, which has this kind of preconceived or presumptive normative attachments to things like firstness and an understanding of geography as territory or land. But they understood the way in which operating the power relationships and forms of violence operating in something like North America spoke across differently marginalized, exploited, and dispossessed communities in ways that, for instance, on our side, Indigenous sort of struggles didn't see as a contradiction to claims to land as a form of relationship. And then I think over time you see that kind of both the relationality and mainstream Indigenous politics start to sort of coalesce into a very exclusive understanding of whose place is this, and what are the kind of what's the hierarchy of rights that are attached to that, which you didn't see in the 1960s. So the universality of the Panthers 10-point program wasn't seen as an ownership over that. It was understood in relationship to other communities of struggle, and Indigenous people saw it as important, at least the ones that I've been talking about, because it didn't contradict an understanding of one's obligations to other that's understood as the practices and knowledges of land, not in a commodified sense, or like a state territorial sense, or even a temporal understanding of it belonging to somebody who was here first, but as a form and practice of relationship. And I think that to a certain extent, some strains within settler colonialism as a newly emergent language really kind of undercuts that relationship or relationality that really foregrounded struggles in a generation previous to us.
Michael? No? Everybody's done? All right. Thank you all so much. And I think Philip has some last words and then we're out.
Okay, thanks a lot. You know, Sarah was talking to Cal Winslow about the Seattle general strike the other night. And what I didn't know was it was not just a question of shutting down the city, they were actually running the city. Mm-hmm. They took it over for 5 days. They were delivering the milk and making the city run. And I think that goes along with Nick's point that almost every strike, wherever it takes place along the circulation, production, or the three axes that Michael talked about, should and probably will be about social reproduction as part of it. And I think both the Canadian actions, or the ones at Standing Rock and the one in Chile, were very, very legible for that reason, that people who didn't really know enough about them, when you heard the phrase water protectors, just not land defending, there is something about that makes you sound like agents of the universe. Why does water need protecting? You know, it suddenly becomes something more about a particular people defending a particular place. And the way Camila describes Chile, which goes from jumping over a turnstile to becoming the total rejection of the last 50 years of a major political change that was totally different than what happened even in Argentina, where there were just military coups where people threw prisoners out of helicopters. But in Chile, it was the creation of a new constitutional order that raised everything before it to the ground and brought in Opus Dei to run the education system. I mean, the number of things that happened, and suddenly it was just this subway, jumping over the subways that let it loose. You know, all the things that the democracy, return to democracy, didn't even address, but which are suddenly back on the table. So extraordinary discussion. We should all go out to a bar, etc., but we can't do it. But I do have a good final line. Anybody see The Onion today yet? The headline? No. Nick's seen it. Protesters criticized for looting businesses without forming private equity firm first. So I think that's a good way to stop on. Thanks, Phil and Camila, Nick, Joshua, Glenn, Sarah, and Michael. We want you back in Red May forever. Next year, in person, over the airwaves. We'll do it anyway. And we do have some more stuff coming for the next 3 days, I think. Stay Friday or Thursday? Where are we? Anybody know?
Thursday, because tomorrow I got to do another one. Remember?
Okay. Friday. Good, yeah. So Sarah's going to be back tomorrow at 3 p.m. With Kathy Weeks and Michelle O'Brien and Sophie Lewis doing Abolish the Family. Michelle has a nice piece on it in EndNotes 5. And then at 6 p.m., we have Predation Confronts Decline. Robert Bremer and Aaron Benedev talking about the economic future. At Saturday at 1, we have COVID and the carceral state, the COVID crisis, the carceral state, with Jackie Wang, Brett Story, Dan Berger, and a lot of great people. And at 5 p.m., we have, what do we have at 5? We have The Ghosts of Marxism, Spectre Editors in Conversation on Crisis. New magazine, Spectre, all the editors have picked one quote from the Marxist tradition. They'll elaborate on it related to crisis. So all good stuff. And on Sunday at 12, Borders and Contagion. So all good. Send us money. Go to www.redmayseattle.org. Click on donate, or do it on our YouTube page at Red May TV. Click the link down there, and also subscribe to the TV channel so we can get more than 1,000 subscribers to get real-time CC captions. Thanks a lot, and enjoy yourself for the rest of the weekend or whatever.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Really great.